Greetings sailors and welcome to Patreon Supporter Spotlight number 63. This time it's going to be an all warships episode, and both replays will actually have a couple of things in common. They're both going to take place here on the Strait map, they're both going to be in light cruisers, and they are both going to involve large amounts of kicking butt. So we're starting off with Fuwas here in the Kuma, which is the tier 4 Japanese light cruiser. And if it looks like a bigger version of the Tenryu, well, it basically kind of was in real life as well. They thought that design was somewhat successful, but just not quite fast enough, and went with a bigger one, essentially. I think most of these ships were used as things like destroyer leaders and sub-flotilla leaders and stuff like that, so they were meant to be able to keep up with reasonably fast ships. And in terms of how that works out in World Warships, well, you've got a very squashy tier 4 cruiser with a decent turn of speed, okay torpedoes for its tier, although they are slow, and a nice spread of guns. It can't quite match the Phoenix for range, however, but really nothing can at this tier. I think the Karlsruhe is probably around this sort of range as well. And Svetlana, well, of course, you can cheat a bit and stick AFT on that one because Russia. But otherwise, yeah, this is a pretty capable little ship. And I think I actually kept mine. Or am I thinking of the tier 3, the Tenryu? I can't remember. I kept one of them. I tend to keep ships from certain tiers just so I've got things to play that I know I'll like. So the short range, even though it's a top tier game, means that you have to be on your toes when you're playing this thing, because, as I've said, it's squashy. He's already lost a fair chunk of health just from one shell, and I think it was even an HE shell from the Orion, although I'm not 100% sure on that. But yeah, your health can vanish awfully quickly, and because you're having to fight at the ranges that you're having to fight at, you don't necessarily have a lot of reaction time. The good news for this particular game is, though, that so far Fu's teammates actually seem to be pulling their weight, and you never really know with low tier, or to be honest, you never really know with any tier how it's going to work out. But in this case, they've taken the A cap, they've taken the B cap, although there's a bunch of enemies there, and the enemy is busy retreating south, or so it seems. They've only lost one ship so far, and the enemy all pulling back to be concentrated together, of course, means that they're all going to have their firepower in one place, which could potentially be very nasty. So another incoming from the Orion there. Fortunately, they were AP shells, so he only had one overpen to deal with. If that was HE, they wouldn't have bounced, because HE doesn't bounce, of course. It can shatter, but it's not going to do so on a Kuma. It's definitely not going to do so on a Kuma. So as long as he can avoid being targeted too heavily by the things with the big nasty guns, he shouldn't be able to do too badly here. But he's also got this Tenryu to deal with up his butt, although that's less of a scary target. That's definitely less of a scary target. It does now seem like the Orion is in serious trouble themselves, so hopefully they're focusing on other things. Something else is targeting him, though, and as it turns out, yes, it was the Orion still, and with their dying shot, they shaved off just a bit more health. In a way, it's almost refreshing to see someone playing an Orion and firing AP shells. Hopefully they will continue doing that up through the tiers, because I mean, of course you can just spam all of the HE with British battleships, but it doesn't stop it being, well, not lazy game design, no, that's the wrong way to look at it, but it doesn't stop it being bad game design. And I've gone over this many times in other videos, but yeah, whatever Wargaming's intent with the British battleships, how it actually works out in practice is not necessarily a good thing for the game. So they've lost the mid cap, which ain't good, and they've also lost a couple more ships, and the enemy team is actually doing better than them at the moment. So in terms of points, in terms of ships, this is maybe starting to slip away from them a little. However, Fu has gotten the gift of a free Wix, who seems determined to charge him down and maybe try and drop torpedoes. I can only conclude that this is a very inexperienced player that's trying to do this, and hopefully will have learned from this experience, because although it's very tempting when you're playing a destroyer, especially if you're new to the game, low tier American destroyer, and you see they've got terrible ranges, so you think, okay, I'll just charge the enemy. If that enemy happens to be a light cruiser, you're going to have a real rough time. You can set up an ambush on a battleship from behind an island or such like, though, however. You know, you can still do quite well with that sort of tactic. But, yeah, not against Takuma. That was never going to go well for that Wix at all. So there's another destroyer down there, and I can't even quite see on the minimap what that is. But alongside that, there's also a Miyogi that's pulling into the B-cap as well. But he's not the only one that is trying to put pressure on the B-cap. There's a Kaiser and a V170 on his own side that are trying to do something. Although the Kaiser is perilously low health, and they've actually taken the interest of the enemy carrier, which is probably not going to be a good thing for them. Although I suspect they were slightly doomed either way. Because the Miyogi, although, and this was 076, this isn't the buffed Miyogi, it's not got a terrific amount of accuracy, or it didn't have when it was in this state. Not that it's still super accurate or anything these days, but yeah, like 1 or 2 penning hits would do the job, because those are still 14-inch shells, and when it hits, they're nasty. So it's now just him and the V170. And although the carrier has pulled back, you know, they might come for Fu next, maybe, but it should have the manoeuvrability to cope with it, because the tier 4 carrier, they don't have a manual drop available. By far the bigger threat right now is this Miyogi, who has taken some damage from the V170. That has to have been some torps, and if Fu is lucky, they might even take some damage from his torps, but the question is, will they live long enough to try and get some shots off? And they do, but they are HE shells, which in contrast to the Orion's HE would not have been nearly so dangerous if they had hit. So that's the major threat out of the way. Although they're not quite clear yet, there's still an Vyacheslav here to deal with also. And those torps are getting a little bit close. But fortunately Fu realises he's not going to be able to turn inside completely, so he wiggles out just far enough to thread the gap in between instead. So at this point his V170 buddy runs off, presumably in search of the carrier, which is slightly vexatious for Fu, because I think he was maybe counting on help with the Vyacheslav, but he does have a Hydro available, so he's popped that. And he is now going to attempt to not die. There's a little clue there with the V170 actually. They just died to burning out, so it's entirely possible they weren't in a position to help the Vyacheslav, which is a fairly competent tier 4 gunboat destroyer. It's not quite anything like you get at the higher tiers with the Soviet/Russian line, but yeah, you don't want to mess around with that too much. Although it's definitely no Clemson. So he takes out that Vyacheslav quite easily, who had a knackered engine and presumably not enough captain points to get the last stand skill. He does still, however, have yet another battleship to deal with, and that's a rather unpleasant one potentially, the Kaiser, because that gets, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, a faster rate of fire because of its smaller caliber guns. It used to be the Kaiser and the Koenig, especially at tier 5, they used to be an absolute terror, just with having basically quite good accuracy to compensate for the fact that they did not especially have big guns for their tier. And it was a very un-German characteristic to have for a German battleship. But no, that got a bit nerfed because I think it was doing a bit too well. And then of course they go and do things like introduce the Giulio Cesare, so who knows, the balancing's sometimes a bit wonky in this game, but it's still not anywhere near World of Tanks levels. So a nice couple of torp hits. Surely this Kaiser won't fall for that again. Surely? Well, we'll see. Meanwhile, they are fortunately, again, firing HE shells. Another battleship firing HE. The one battleship you would have thought would be firing all of the HE was in fact firing AP shells, and all of the rest have been firing HE. There's some kind of irony there. So he's just going to ignore him for now, try and help out his own remaining allied ship, this Miyogi, against this Shenyang, who must be close enough that they're being spotted firing in the smoke. I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, so there's another torp hit, and although that hasn't quite killed the Kaiser, they are in fact flooding out, so that will do. I think they were flooding out all the while, in fact, and that's his Kraken. Now unfortunately he could not save the Myogi, who was also flooding out, but he does now have the undivided attention of, well, both his own and the enemy carrier, and his own carrier is helping out by disrupting at least one of these torp drops, which is all he can do because it's a Langley and it only has one squad of each. So he turns into the non-disrupted drop and is able to actually kill his speed through killing his speed and turning at the same time, sufficiently to not take one on the nose, which would have been fatal at this point, and because the other drop was disrupted by the fighters, he's easily able to just turn through that gap as well. So that leaves an enemy carrier and this Karlsruhe to deal with, who is unfortunately full health. However, the Karlsruhe can also see the Langley, and what do you think the Karlsruhe is going to be shooting at? Is it going to be the ship that can fire back at him immediately, that's low health, that would get them points? Or is it going to be the carrier? Yeah, I think we're seeing the carrier effect in here, and this is true for basically all tiers. A carrier pops up, and regardless of the immediate tactical circumstances, people will immediately switch fire. It's just something about carriers. People love to kill carriers in the same way that people love to kill artillery in World of Tanks, I suppose. But in this case, it is absolutely the wrong thing to do. He should be killing the low health Kuma. And at that point, he can then safely just go after the carrier. But instead, no, he's giving Fu free rein to pummel away and try and kill him. And of course, the carrier is going to be trying to kill him as well. So it's not like trying to kill a carrier is 100% always an invalid reaction. It's just quite often you'll see people drop anything else they might be doing and turn around to fire their guns at a carrier, even if it's actually quite a bad idea. And in this case, it absolutely is. He could kill Fu so easily. The Karlsruhe's range is pretty pants, but I don't remember it being that much worse than the Kuma. They might even be in range right now, I'm not sure. But no, they're just plugging away at this Bogue. Not even a Bogue, a Langley. They're just plugging away at this Langley, completely ignoring the ship that is killing them by degrees. Although, it's taking a little while, and if he was closer, you know, he could have used AP to much better effect, but at this range, the 140mm AP is probably not going to be terribly effective. So he's just relying on a bit of HE spam. And I've no idea, by the way, the state of Fu's captain skills. I do know he's one of those players that enjoys a lot of the low tier ships simply because they are, you know, the First World War and interwar ships, which tend to be at the low and mid tiers. And, well, you know, it might be he's played this enough to have a decently skilled captain on it. I don't know. He's clearly training up captain skills by using the Pi camo, but whether he's got IFHE or things like Demo Expert or not, I honestly have no idea of knowing. But either way, you know, given enough time and the fact that this Karlsruhe is totally ignoring him, this is sort of inevitable. Although, the question is, of course, will he be able to save the Langley in the process? It doesn't seem like it. The Langley is now very low health, which is not so good for Fu because he's lost his air support at this point. So Karlsruhe, yes, you have indeed killed the Langley, but at what cost? So it is now just Fu versus the enemy carrier, and although he doesn't have particularly good AA, they've now established, with the caps and the time that they've got, they've now actually established a lead, and I don't think Fu at this point thought they were going to make it, but no, they're close enough on points and there is enough time that they can overtake and win. And basically all he has to do is stay alive. Now there are, of course, going to be waves of carrier planes coming at him, but this Langley, or is it even a Langley? No, it's not a Langley, it's a Hosho. This Hosho player keeps dropping in front of him, apart from anything else, so this is not an experienced player especially, and so dodging drops like this isn't especially difficult to do. And I think he is tempted to actually chase down the Hosho and go for it. But, you know, this is the point where we're crossing over in terms of the victory points. And if he gets close enough, if he gets too close, the Hosho does have defensive armament. And if that, you know, it's not a lot, but if that gun were to set him on fire, then well, that could be that, you know. The 2,500 health is not a huge amount. I mean, it's unlikely. He probably still could have gone after the carrier and gotten more damage. But in the end, he chose the sensible course of action and is actually just sitting it out, basically, waiting for the timer to run down. And they are now comfortably ahead on points. Well, I say comfortably. Not that comfortably, but they are ahead on points, and that's all that matters, really. And so, in the dying seconds, although the carrier makes a go of it, one last drop, they just don't have the time. So 121,000, almost 122,000 damage in a Kuma with a Confederate, a Kraken, a High Caliber, and a Liquidator medal. And I know there was a fair bit of low tier derpery going on there, and I know Fu is probably more an experienced player than a lot of these other players that are in this game, but for a Kuma, that's still quite an impressive result. And you would have to be a more experienced player to pull off that kind of win under those kind of circumstances. So, considering the fragility of the Kuma, yeah, I thought that was quite an entertaining match. There were various points at which the enemy team certainly could have won it. That Karlsruhe alone massively just ended up throwing the game away. But, you know, you watch these things and maybe a newer player watches them and learns something from them, hopefully. Anyway, on to our next match, and this time it's Manti in the Leander, and again with carriers. That's another thing that links these games. Now, this is pretty good matchmaking. This is about as good as it's ever going to get. There aren't even any tier 6 battleships to worry about. But having said that, it's still a Leander. It's still a fragile ship, just as the Kuma is. It is, however, the first of the British cruiser line where you start to feel like your firepower is actually worth a damn. The Emerald, you can have occasional nice games in. If you get the good matchmaking, then the Emerald can not totally suck. But quite frequently with the Emerald, you are down tiered and the guns can just feel utterly ineffective. With the Leander, however, I can't remember if the guns themselves are different, but the shells certainly are, and crucially you've also gone from these annoying to use single mounts to proper twin mount turrets. And so it's a lot easier to get more of your firepower to bear. So he took a somewhat risky move by breaking stealth to fire at that destroyer in the sea cap, but well, as long as he doesn't fire again, he should stealth up, and there it is. And of course, British cruisers generally are very, very sneaky. It's one of the characteristics that Gaijin gave them to help them survive that bit longer, because if they had horrible stealth, then they'd get blatted out of the water very easily. So having joined his two allied destroyers in the middle and put himself in a really good position to plink away at these enemy ships to the south, he smokes up, because of course this is the other trick of the British cruisers generally, is they get to make their own cover. Although these days you've got to be a little bit more careful. This is a current patch replay, and you'll notice on the minimap in particular there's that little marker that now tells you exactly where your guns are aiming. And I point this out because that's going to be rather relevant later on, but it's also relevant if you're in one of these things, especially if you're sat stationary, because people will now have, theoretically, a somewhat easier time shooting at you. Not necessarily if you have been able to smoke up whilst stealthed. It isn't going to be any easier than it was already in that case. But if you are spotted and then smoke and then stick around in the same position that you were last spotted, yeah, you can't do that anymore. You really can't, not unless you want people to use this new little minimap marker to be able to fire at your exact position. So he's just blinking away. You know, this is about as good as it gets in this ship, a broadside battleship at less than 10 km. Although in the case of the Congo, they don't have a massive amount of superstructure to hit. I mean, it's, you know, it's tall, but it's not like it occupies a huge amount of deck space. So the overall amount of damage from that wasn't bad, but it wasn't anything spectacular. Ideally, you want, ideally you want to be in a platoon with a division rather with somebody else that can give you smoke as well, so that you can sit and plink away for even longer. But in this case, well, like Fu, he is playing solo. So while all that was going on, Manti apparently failed to notice the Omaha coming in from the north and getting a bit close. In fact, within torpedo range at this point. And guess whose hydro has just run out. Fortunately, however, they dropped on the smoke, so they were well wide of the mark. But yeah, I think that caught Manti a little bit wrong-footed. I don't think he was quite paying attention to the minimap enough there, and so he's losing a little bit of health right now. But of course, he has the heal, so it's not quite as bad as it might otherwise have been. So this is an awkward position. There are ships to the north, there are ships to the south, and his own team, I don't quite know what they're doing, to be honest. There's a whole blob of them around the carrier, and then there's a pair of destroyers to the east. And none of them particularly are showing any interest in the cap circles, apart from Manti and this Dallas that he's with. It's not really a good looking minimap right now, and the enemy team is already pulling well ahead in points. So it's a very different set of circumstances than we had last time. A very different set of circumstances, and this is almost the harder one to see how it might be pulled back, because he's squashy, and that's a New York closing to very close range. And because they're coming bow on, there's not much of a chance that he'll be able to do anything in terms of a devastating strike. So he correctly predicts the Fushun's torps, which forces him to back out of his smoke screen, but he's able to just accelerate back inside quickly. And during that time, interestingly enough, the New York does not fire at him. He also gets a hit and a flooding, but unlike other cruisers, he can't take advantage of that by setting this New York on fire unless he gets very lucky and one of his secondary guns actually sets a fire, which is possible. It is possible, but that's the only way you're going to do it. Of course, you can try and stack dot damage by getting another flooding, of course, but that's not guaranteed, and you've only got one torp launcher per side, so it's a little bit harder to do than the Emeralds, say, which actually gets two. So there's that Fushun out of the way. Fortunately, the New York is just ignoring him, but this is a very awkward position right now. He does, however, have some support from that blob of ships to his west firing up at these ships, or rather, not so much that actually, it's more they're firing at his allied ships, and so that gives him a little bit of a window here. But that blob to the west appears to have been singularly useless for the most part. They're pretty much all dead apart from, what is that, an Iron Duke and Fubuki, who is now coming towards the middle. Meanwhile, the Dallas is engaging with the New York at very close range and presumably pumping all kinds of AP shells in, or maybe a mix of AP and HE, because surprisingly they're going to walk away from that one alive. You would think at that close range the New York would stand a fairly decent chance, but as it is, no, the Dallas has actually managed to take care of that problem, which is good news for Manti. However, the Dallas also paid a rather hefty price in doing so. They only just came out of that alive, so yeah, they've now died to a Nuremberg firing from the south. Still only have 2 cap circles. They have killed a whole bunch of enemy ships at this point, but despite that, the enemy team has over twice as many points. And this is why you don't ignore the cap circles. And this is why his team blobbing up in a totally useless position and then, for the most part, dying there is really not helping matters at all. However, given that there are so few ships on both sides, it does help Manty's ability to now dictate the engagements a bit more, pick his fights, and go for the one-on-one fights that he thinks he can get a better chance with. And so, because the Nürnberg is alone and sort of backed up by the carrier, but because they don't have any other immediate support, unlike the Alba and the other two ships closing down from the north on that Iron Duke, who is definitely screwed at this point. He's gone for the safer option of removing this high health Nürnberg, which is still a dangerous ship, and at that point maybe he'll be able to take a crack at the carrier as well. They've got their own destroyer also going for the carrier at this point, and the Nürnberg's actually concentrating on that, although something is aiming at Manty right now, or was for a moment, and is again. Possibly it's the Alba trying to see if they can get a shot, or one of the other ships, but it's definitely not the Nürnberg. And at this point, well, having said what I said earlier about going for the carrier, that's exactly what Manty does. And in this case, I mean, there are planes around, but given that the Nürnberg is firing away at his Fushun ally, yeah, I think he might have done better at this point, continuing to concentrate on the Nürnberg rather than putting those couple of salvos into the carrier. Although it seems unlikely he would have killed the Nürnberg, given the Nürnberg's angling right now. He still would have done some damage, but as it is, the Fushun is not going to survive. So I think that was a slight miscalculation, but that it's incredibly likely the end outcome would have been the same regardless. I think that Fushun probably still would have died. It's just that would have been, to my mind, the better thing to do, rather than plink away at the Bogue. And I keep saying plink, but I don't know. There's just something about these AP-only ships that I'm so used to when I've played them in the past, getting shatters and whatever else, that it can feel like that. Anyway, so, yeah, he takes out that Nürnberg, though, and now it's basically just him and one remaining destroyer, which is, I think, a Mutsuki. Or is it a Fubuki? Oh, that's a Fubuki, right? Yeah, that's a Fubuki. So they've gotten 2 cap circles, but the enemy team still has a massive points lead, and they are threatening the B cap. However, as it stands, the one that's threatening the B cap is a low health cruiser. And so that is worth breaking stealth for, even though it's almost certainly going to immediately get all of the remaining ships firing at him. It's one of those times when you're just going to have to trust in your ability to dodge out of the way of incoming fire. Now, the shooting at this point was not great. It wasn't giving a correct lead in some circumstances, and it was shooting it long in others. But I think he was feeling the pressure a bit at this point, because this is it. There's a chance of winning this one, but you absolutely can't afford to screw anything up. So I think it's understandable if he wasn't entirely playing his absolute best at this moment. And Lord knows I don't do that well under pressure either, so yeah, I can definitely understand it. So rather than face down 2 enemy ships firing at him, he's actually going to stealth up again, which I think was the correct call, get his turrets around, and interestingly he swings around south, which is not necessarily what I would have done, but I think he has maybe the idea of trying to just engage this Nürnberg, and he's hoping that the Congo will... well, the Congo appears to be going for the B cap, so I think maybe he's just hoping to get some islands between them. I'm not 100% certain, but it's still... I mean, it's a Congo, it has the range. The longer the range they're firing at, the better, of course, but it's not going to be quite the one-on-one engagement he wants, even though the one that he wants to focus on is by far the closer ship. So some torps out, because you never know. but it does just seem to be the Nürnberg that's firing at him. And yeah, that's not YouTube that did that, by the way. That's a little weird graphical glitch from when I was actually recording this. That's OBS having a funny moment. I don't think I've ever seen OBS do that before. Not entirely sure why it did, but anyway. Yeah, fortunately for him, it is just this Nürnberg that's firing at him. The Congo is currently, I assume, dodging Fubuki torps. So instead of this being a far more dangerous situation than it could be, it has turned out to be a one-on-one fight. But pretty much because that Congo isn't backing up the Nürnberg. If the Nürnberg and the Congo had stuck together and were focusing Manti right now, this would definitely be different. But it's even possible that the Fubuki had opened fire, that they were deliberately distracting that Congo and trying to be a good teammate and to pull firepower away from Manti. And if that was what they were trying to do, then it's absolutely worked. There is a bit of a moment though where he doesn't realise he's slamming into the border and ends up uncomfortably broadside, but does get away with it despite the fact that Nürnberg is firing AP shells. So that's a final kill, a 6th kill, alongside the Confederate non-high caliber. He's gotten himself a Kraken in this one. Again, that's another thing linking both these replays. And again, this is going to come down to points. The Congo is taking some damage from the Fubuki. They've landed some torp hits. And I really have to commend that Fubuki for some very, very good team play at the end there. If they hadn't pulled the Congo away, or if the Congo hadn't gotten distracted, you know, either way, this would have been potentially a very different outcome. But as it is, because they got all 3 caps, because he killed that last Nürnberg, and because the Congo was distracted suitably, that ended up being a win. 131,000 damage done, so that's even better than the previous result, and even better still XP. That was what, 2k, about 2k base XP the last game. This was 2,700, with that Fubuki in 2nd place quite comfortably, and just a really nice result. I mean, it was very good matchmaking, and again, there were certain enemy ships that did things wrong, but you know, you can say at moments Manti made a few errors that could have ended a lot worse as well, so there was definitely an element of luck there, but still, that was a very good showing for the Leander. It goes to show that, you know, the heal and the stealth and the smoke and all of it together, it's worth grinding through to. There is light at the end of the tunnel if you're enduring the low tier British cruisers, because the low tier ones especially are fairly horrid. And as I said earlier, the Enterprise, at least the Emerald rather, can have its moments, but it's not really till you get to the Leander that they start to shine a bit more. And then of course there's the Fiji, which is the favourite ship of certain people I know for a very good reason. So that's it for this episode. Hopefully you have enjoyed this pair of replays, and if you have, you can do all the usual things down underneath the video, and as always, stay tuned for more.